It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning. The sun was barely climbing over the rooftops of a quiet suburban street, where a father and his young daughter waited patiently at the bus stop. The little girl clutched her backpack, humming, softly, her braids bouncing with each sway. Her father stood tall beside her, calm, collected, holding a briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. But what happened next would shatter that calm. Out of nowhere, an older man, stern-faced, his voice sharp like broken glass, turned toward them. His words weren't just cruel, they carried the heavy weight of generations of hate. In that instant, the father faced a choice. Ignore the insult and let his daughter believe silence was strength, or respond in a way that could change not just her view of the world, but everyone else's who was watching. What unfolded at that quiet bus stop would leave bystanders stunned, a community shaken, and a lesson that no one would ever forget. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover powerful, untold stories that shed light on injustice, resilience, and hope. Every subscription helps us spread these important messages to more people around the world. Now, back to our story. It was a quiet, sunlit morning in a suburban neighborhood in Ohio. The streets were lined with freshly cut lawns, mailboxes neatly in a row, and the sound of birds cutting through the stillness. On this particular morning, a father named Marcus stood with his daughter Jasmine at the bus stop. Marcus was in his late 30s, a man who carried himself with quiet strength. He wore a crisp button-up shirt, slacks, and polished shoes, ready for another long day at work. Beside him, Jasmine was all energy and innocence, her pink backpack nearly as big as she was, her tiny fingers wrapped around a lunchbox her mother had carefully packed the night before. Marcus had always believed in routines. The morning walk to the bus stop wasn't just about getting Jasmine to school. It was about the conversations they shared, the lessons he could pass on in those few minutes before the bus arrived. It was their time, a father and daughter ritual, that grounded both of them before the busyness of the day. The neighborhood, on the surface, was calm and welcoming. Families waved to each other, kids rode their bikes down the sidewalks, and joggers passed by with nods of familiarity. But beneath the surface, Marcus knew that not everyone looked at him and his family the same way. Subtle glances at the grocery store, whispers at community events, and the occasional comment made it clear that some neighbors saw him as an outsider, even though he had lived in the area for years, paid his taxes, volunteered at local events, and contributed just as much as anyone else. That morning, Marcus had no idea that the undercurrent of prejudice would break the surface in front of his little girl. As he stood at the bus stop sipping his coffee, Jasmine tugged on his hand, asking about her spelling test. He smiled, assuring her that she'd do great, just like always. But as he answered her, he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. An elderly man in his 70s had walked up and was now standing a few feet away. His face was stern, his jaw clenched. Marcus had seen him around the neighborhood before, but had never spoken to him directly. The man's posture carried impatience, like he had something he needed to say but was holding it back, at least for the moment. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes shared the same bus stop, and silence between strangers wasn't unusual. But the air shifted when the man's eyes landed on Marcus and Jasmine. His gaze lingered, sharp and unwelcoming, a silent disapproval that was hard to ignore. What Marcus didn't yet know was that this morning, silence wouldn't last. The man's words, when they finally came, would tear through the calm of the neighborhood and force everyone, Marcus, his daughter, and even the strangers passing by, to confront a truth that too many people still tried to ignore. The stage was set. A peaceful bus stop, a father and daughter, and a stranger whose bitterness would ignite something far larger than a simple morning routine. The minutes ticked by slowly, the kind of quiet stillness where every sound seemed louder than it should be. A car passed in the distance. The hum of cicadas carried through the air. Jasmine shifted her backpack and leaned against her father's side, her eyes fixed on the corner where the yellow school bus would eventually appear. The elderly man, however, wasn't focused on the bus. His attention was locked on Marcus, his expression darkening by the second. At first, it was subtle, the tightening of his lips, the way his eyes narrowed, but then his muttering began. Soft at first, just enough for Marcus to catch words that dripped with bitterness. It was the kind of tone that carried a lifetime of prejudice, the type Marcus had heard before in smaller, quieter ways. But suddenly, the quiet muttering turned into words spoken loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "People like you don't belong here." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Jasmine's humming stopped. A mother walking her dog down the street slowed her steps, glancing over with confusion. Marcus froze, his coffee cup halfway lifted, unsure whether to respond or let the man's words dissolve into the air like so many insults before. But the man wasn't finished. His voice grew sharper, almost triumphant, as though he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Why don't you take your kid and go back to Africa where you came from?" The words sliced through the calm morning, leaving behind a silence that felt suffocating. Jasmine's eyes widened, her grip on Marcus's hand tightening. She was too young to understand the full weight of the insult, but old enough to know it wasn't right. Her innocent morning ritual had been broken, replaced by confusion and fear. Around them, the neighborhood stirred. A man jogging past slowed, his pace, removing his earbuds. The mother with the dog stood frozen at the corner. A pair of teenagers waiting further down the street stopped talking altogether, their eyes darting between Marcus and the elderly man. The world seemed to narrow around the bus stop, every gaze locked on the unfolding confrontation. Marcus's first instinct was silence. He had endured words like this before. He had grown up knowing that responding in anger only fed the hate. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. His daughter stood at his side, watching every move, every decision. And the crowd, neighbors, strangers, children, was watching too. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to take a slow, measured breath. He wouldn't let anger control him. He couldn't. Because sometimes silence was mistaken for agreement. And in that silence, ignorance only grew stronger. The old man adjusted his stance, clearly expecting no reply, his face set in smug satisfaction. He clutched his walking stick like a badge of authority, as if years of age gave his words more power. But the silence that followed didn't work in his favor. The neighborhood wasn't rallying behind him. In fact, the air was charged with discomfort, unease spreading like a current. People looked at Marcus, not with pity, but with expectation. Would he walk away? Would he let it slide? Or would he finally say what so many had wanted to say in moments just like this? Marcus slowly lowered his coffee cup to the ground and stood taller. His posture shifted, not aggressive but commanding. His presence filled the space, his calmness almost louder than the insult itself. Jasmine, still holding his hand, looked up at him with wide eyes. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her father's silence meant something, was coming, and so did the crowd. The neighborhood bus stop had become more than a waiting place for children. It had transformed into a stage. The elderly man's venomous words had set the scene. And now, everyone leaned in, waiting, bracing for what Marcus would do next. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, pressing on everyone like the humid air before a storm. Marcus stood tall, his gaze steady on the old man who had just tried to reduce him and his daughter to nothing more than unwelcome outsiders. Jasmine's tiny hand clutched his own, her trust evident in the way she leaned closer, looking for reassurance. Marcus took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with purpose. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't raised. It was calm, measured, and carried a depth that made people stop shifting in place and listen. "You say we don't belong here," he began, his words deliberate, each one weighed before leaving his mouth. "But the truth is, my family's history in this country runs deeper than you could imagine." The man blinked, his smug expression faltering for the first time. The crowd around the bus stop leaned in. Marcus's presence commanded attention, and his story was only just beginning. "My great-grandfather was born in the South," Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "He worked fields he would never own, breaking his back day after day so that his children might have a chance at something better. And his father, my great-great-grandfather, wasn't even considered a man by this country. He was a slave. He was kidnapped, chained, sold like property, beaten down but never broken. And for what? To build the very foundation of this land we stand on today." The air seemed to shift. The teenagers down the street stepped closer. The mother with the dog covered her mouth. Even the jogger who had paused earlier stood completely still, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Marcus's voice grew stronger, though still steady. "My grandfather fought in World War II. He put on this country's uniform, crossed an ocean, and risked his life for freedoms that, when he came home, weren't even granted to him. He couldn't sit at the same counters. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But still, he believed in America's promise. He stayed. He raised his children to work hard, to believe that one day this country would treat them like equals." The old man's grip tightened on his walking stick. His lips twitched as if he wanted to respond, but the weight of Marcus's words pressed too heavily on him to interrupt. "And my parents," Marcus continued, his voice softening but never losing. "It's power. They carried that fight forward in their own way. My mother spent her life teaching children, black, white, it didn't matter, because she believed education could change the world. My father, he worked as a mechanic, the kind of man who would pull over on the side of the road to help someone like you, even if you wouldn't give him the same kindness." The bystanders shifted, glancing at each other. The quiet was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of shame, of reflection. Marcus bent slightly, setting his coffee cup aside, freeing both hands as he stood straighter, taller, as though every generation of his family stood with him at that bus stop. "So when you tell me I don't belong here," Marcus said, his tone now edged with sadness, "you're not just insulting me. You're dismissing the blood, sweat, and tears of generations who helped build this country, people who gave more than you'll ever know, so that someone like me could stand here today with my daughter and believe in a better future." Jasmine's eyes widened, her father's words settling into her young heart. She didn't yet understand the full weight of history, but she understood pride. She understood strength, and she knew her father was teaching her something she would never forget. Marcus's gaze swept the crowd now, not just the man. "Ignorance doesn't go away if we stay silent," he said firmly. "If I walk away now, what lesson does my daughter learn? That hatred wins? That silence protects us? No. The only way to confront this kind of poison is to shine light on it. For her, for you, for everyone standing here today." A hush fell over the entire street. The school bus still hadn't arrived, but in that moment nobody cared. Strangers who moments earlier were just going about their routines were now witnesses to a truth too powerful to ignore. The elderly man's face flushed red. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance now replaced by trembling, hands and a stare that wavered. For the first time, he looked small. Not because Marcus towered over him, but because his hate, stripped bare, had no ground left to stand on. And in that silence, in that moment where every eye was watching, Marcus had transformed an insult meant to diminish him into a lesson that elevated everyone present. The street was silent, the air thick with the weight of what had just been said. For a moment it seemed as though even time had stopped, waiting to see what would happen next. The old man who had spoken so harshly now stood frozen, his walking stick trembling slightly in his grip. His face, once hard and smug, was flushed with a mix of anger and something he wasn't prepared to admit. Shame. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The power he thought he carried with his insult had been stripped away, leaving him bare before the neighbors who had heard every word. His gaze darted around, searching for support, but found none. The joggers stared at him with narrowed eyes. The mother with the dog shook her head, her expression one of quiet disappointment. Even the teenagers, who moments ago were giggling about nothing, stood still, their faces serious, absorbing every ounce of what Marcus had said. And then it happened. Something small but powerful. A man wearing a baseball cap who had been leaning against a mailbox across the street stepped forward. His voice cracked through the silence. "He's right," the man said firmly. "We've got to be better than this." The words seemed to unlock the crowd. Another neighbor, a woman holding her toddler, nodded and added softly, "My grandfather fought in that same war. He always told us the only color that mattered was red, white, and blue. Nothing else." Slowly, like ripples spreading across water, voices began to rise. A teenager spoke up, "That's messed up, man. He didn't deserve that." The dog walker chimed in, "No one does." The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a moment of hate transformed into a collective reckoning. People weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants, acknowledging that silence in the face of ignorance was no longer acceptable. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile triumphantly or look for applause. He simply stood steady, his daughter still holding his hand, her eyes wide but glowing with admiration. He bent slightly to her level, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. In that quiet gesture, he told her that strength didn't always come from raising your voice, but from knowing when to use it with purpose. The elderly man, seeing the tide had turned against him, shuffled backward a step. His shoulders slumped, his earlier fire gone. For a brief second, he looked far older than his years, weighed down by the heavy realization that his words had not only failed to wound, but had revealed his own smallness. Without another word, he turned and began walking away, his figure, retreating down the street. But even in retreat, the lesson remained. The neighbors had seen, they had felt, and they would not forget. The bus finally arrived, its brakes hissing as it pulled to the curb. The sound snapped everyone back to reality, though the moment lingered heavy in their hearts. Jasmine climbed onto the steps, pausing to glance back at her father. She gave him a small smile, one that carried both pride and relief, before disappearing onto the bus with the other children. As the vehicle rumbled away, Marcus remained still for a moment, longer his thoughts quiet but deep. He hadn't spoken out to humiliate the old man. He hadn't spoken out to draw applause. He had done it because silence in moments like these was dangerous, because his daughter was watching, learning, and shaping her view of the world, and because every person in that crowd needed to hear what had been left unsaid for too long. Later that evening, Marcus sat at the dinner table with his wife. He recounted the morning's events, not in boastful tones, but in reflective ones. His wife listened carefully, her expression shifting from concern to pride. When he finished, she reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You planted a seed," she said quietly. "And sometimes that's all you can do. Plant a seed and let it grow." Meanwhile, across town, the elderly man sat alone in his dimly lit living room. His dinner plate sat untouched. Marcus's words replayed in his mind, louder than the hum of the television he wasn't really watching. He thought of his own grandchildren, their laughter, their innocence, and wondered what kind of world he wanted them to inherit. For the first time in a long while, doubt cracked through the armor of his prejudice. In the days that followed, whispers of the bus stop incident spread through the neighborhood. People spoke of Marcus's composure, of his courage, of the way he had turned venom into truth. Some approached him at the grocery store or on his evening walks, thanking him for what he had said. Others shared their own experiences of prejudice, stories they had kept quiet for too long. The moment had become more than an encounter. It had become a spark, and for Jasmine, the lesson was lasting. That morning at the bus stop became a memory etched deep into her young mind, a reminder that her father had chosen dignity over anger, truth over silence. It was a lesson she would carry with her, one that would shape how she faced the world. Moments like these remind us of the power we hold, not in fists, not in shouting matches, but in the strength of truth, spoken calmly and with conviction. They remind us that silence can be dangerous, but words, chosen carefully, can change hearts, shift perspectives, and even begin to dismantle prejudice. So, to everyone watching this story, ask yourself, when hate shows its face, will you look away or will you plant a seed of truth? Because sometimes all it takes is one voice, steady, calm, and unshaken, to change everything.